Hello and welcome to the latest FLITe series webinar. Through our work at FinPro and off the back of our podcast, the Leadership in Insurance podcast, we are exposed to many issues that are topical or current. Sometimes we're in the position to do something about it in our role as a recruitment business. We specialise in insurtech, so we have a good awareness of the industry. And one issue that's cropped up is the lack of female leadership in the insurance technology businesses. Now, 64% of employees in insurance are women, but only 18% are CEOs. This is nothing new, this is not surprising, and we can see that the numbers are just simply not representative in the traditional insurance industry, but it's depressing that in a nascent industry, one that in many aspects is so forward-thinking, it's disappointing to see this theme of gender inequality be mirrored. There are simply not enough female leaders. And what can we do about that? Well, one thing that we are able to do as a recruitment business is to build networks and provide platforms to support and discussion for women in this industry. And hence why we're here in this webinar today. We decided to centre today's discussion around startup funding journeys from the venture capital perspective. Now, we personally looked at 1,000 insurtechs founded in 2010 or later that had received some kind of funding. Of those, only 10% had both male and female founders, less than 3% had female-only founders. So gender disparity in VC investment mirrors this. Female-founded teams represented just 2.8% of all capital invested into US startups last year. This discussion looks at diversity, equity and inclusion, DE&I, as more than just moral imperatives. They have a direct impact on growth. Diversity reduces groupthink and makes firms more innovative and competitive. Consumers, investors and venture partners also increasingly look to DE&I when deciding where to put their money. And with this in mind, we brought together a panel of insurtech specialists and investors to get their take on the DE&I agenda and why the worlds of insurance and venture capital are so lacking in diversity. So, after that slightly bleak introduction, it'd be great if we could kind of go round and introduce ourselves. I know some of you will be known to the people who are listening, but it'd be great if we could introduce, just because of where my screen's focused, Rebecca, you're to the left of me. So Rebecca, if you'd be kind enough to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Boston. I'm the Director of Research and Insight at insurtech. I joined the insurance world actually 10 months ago, having spent 20 years in energy. I've spent the last 15 years as a very strong advocate of DEI in the corporate world, but also in the wider world. And yeah, I'm really excited about having this discussion today.
Thank you very much. Sabine, if you'd be so kind.
So yes, thank you very much, Alex. I'm Sabine van der Linden. I run Alchemy Crew, which is a venture lab. I work with large insurers to help them commercialize, industrialize, and democratize the ability to work with young ventures and growth ventures as well, by helping them not only look at big problems and solve them directly with ventures, but also build the frameworks which allow them to scale their initiative across markets. I have been, I guess, in the DEI sphere. I've been in insurance for 25 years, which means that I've been surrounded by great gentlemen and great women too, probably fewer than the great gentlemen I've worked with over the past 25 years. And the key thing for me is 5 years ago, I decided to go into the insurtech world. 5-6 years ago, I decided to go into the insurtech world. And one of the key things I realized as I built my team, which made a lot of the insurers I work with quite impressed, is that for some reason, I always selected a very diverse team. My goal was always to reflect the product and the services we bought out there, and making sure that through diversity, we could actually make sure that we build for the future. So DI is very important to me, and partly, I think, the equity angle and the inclusion angle of the definition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Sabine. And James, finally, if you'd be kind enough to explain who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, James Tootle, I'm an investment director at EOS Venture Partners. We're an early stage venture investor in insurtech, focused globally. So we have a team in the UK, team in the US, and advisory partners and operating partners globally. I've also spent the last 14 years in insurance. always from an investment, finance and deals perspective, and coming up to 6 years of that focused on insurtech. And I think Sabine was one of the first people I met when insurtech was coined a thing. Back in London, almost 6 years ago now. So Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to, sharing some of our thoughts, my thoughts on sort of how EOS is approaching investing and putting sort of ESG and D&I at the heart of what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And finally, because I sort of arrogantly barreled in like everyone knew who I was, I'm Alex Bonder, founder and managing director of FinPro, which is an insurtech specialist search firm. And we specialize in working with companies in anything from seed to Series B. Rebecca, if you'd be so kind, kind of as sort of framing the conversation, that why is acknowledging and tackling these disparities in funding so crucial to discuss?
I think it's important because you need to think of how we got there. How did we get to, I don't know, I think you said between 5 and 10, or even there might have been a 2 or 3% female founded businesses. How do we get to that position when women make up 50% of the population? And I think if you look at it in 2 buckets, first of all, there's a startup pipeline. So if you imagine, let's just focus on 2 industries that I know better, insurance and technology. As Sabine mentioned, maybe not the most diverse, gender, other protected characteristics, not the most diverse. So if you imagine most entrepreneurs, when they're looking to innovate, disrupt, they're probably already working in the industry that they want to disrupt. So if you imagine, let's be very generous and say 30% of the industry in, insurance and technology is women, in particular if we include like early careers where there tends to be more diversity. So you're not starting the pipeline at 50%, you're starting the pipeline at 30. Then let's say maybe 10% are self-selecting out. And I know that's a very controversial term, but I think it is a real term that I know many people have done. And, that could be because they're not seeing role models like themselves working in the startup space. It could be because of societal expectations around household responsibilities, caring responsibilities. So we're already down to, let's say, 20%. Let's increase it up to 25. Some new people decide, insurance and technology is for them. Let's go back up to 25. So then how do we end up with 10, 5, 2%? What is happening in the allocation? So if all that 25% technically have equal access to the funding pot, how come they're not staying, and they end up being 25% female founded organizations? And it goes back to that word that Sabine used, equity. So I always think of equality and equity with a really clear example. So if you invite 2 people to a building that's in 2 stories, and one is a wheelchair user and one is not a wheelchair user, and you bring them both into the building and the non-wheelchair user walks up the stairs and the wheelchair user is down at the bottom. Here, that person has equal access to the stairs. There's no problem there. They just can't use the stairs. There's a barrier for them to use it. But if you installed a lift or chose a building which had a lift, suddenly you have equity. They have the ability to go upstairs and access that same, in this particular analogy, pot of money, as we're saying. So, and this is the challenge, is that if the pipeline itself is already really small by the time it gets to applying for funding, and then actually, the concept has been, but there's, it's equal access. But it might not be equitable allocation or equitable access. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that, we are losing people all along the chain, and then you're ending up with so few, and then you're not getting that special, magic, which is diversity of thought. You're just getting innovation and disruption from quite similar people, and that's not where the magic happens.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that's where, yeah, exactly. You're not getting true innovation because you're not getting enough separate voices or different voices coming into the room. Sabine, you sort of touched on this on your intro, but I was going to ask you, James, like why is it important for you in the venture space to sort of talk about these issues and kind of discuss this as part of the kind of venture capital world?
And I think it's actually right the way across all industries and venture. It's not just sort of exclusive to insurtech.
Sure.
I think it's important to talk about things because at first, to solve a problem, you actually have to at first acknowledge there is one, and think about what are the steps to take to make improvements. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require more knowledge transfer within the whole industry, more awareness, more transparency of processes, more access for individuals and females, and to have the right access to tools and resources and investment to be able to materially change the situation that exists today. And I think there are some great organizations out there that are trying to make those changes. Maybe we'll come on to those a bit later.
Sure.
But I think that this has to be that acknowledgement in the first instance, which is why I think it's important to talk about it. And then there has to be, people have to take charge and responsibility for making changes within their organization. So us as investors, we're thinking more in terms of, are there some of these certain initiatives out there that we can sign up to become more educated, to more knowledgeable, to get better access to female founders? Are there ways that we can improve our deal sourcing to be more aware of, maybe we've got biases in the way that we approach deal sourcing, and therefore we actually need to be more proactive in finding the right, female founders to be able to even have the ability to invest in them. Throughout the diligence process, are we asking the right questions? Are we being aware of, again, biases in the investment process? Are we acknowledging and tracking how many female founding teams we speak to? Is it a mixed female? Is it a mixed gender team, or is it all female, or is it all male? We've started to introduce those types of metrics into our deal sourcing. And then actually it flows through all into our portfolio companies. So actually we've now started to write into our term sheets that the portfolio companies have to have, robust D&I frameworks and policies that we can help them implement. And then we can track across our portfolio, how many, what is the sort of gender balance within the team, at the senior level. And I think, all of that stems from getting knowledgeable on some of the issues and topics, and then actually being able to put some tangible actions into place to be able to help sort of try and solve and rectify that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so good to hear about the practical elements of it, and I think that's the kind of danger with these conversations. Rebecca, you and I have spoken at various events in the past about this, is that talking's great, awareness is great, but it's great to hear some of the practical applications. James, just to go back to you, sorry, what's the kind of biggest change, do you think, in terms of your style of investing over the last 5 years in respect to this issue? Is it all those incremental kind of elements and putting those as parts of term sheets in terms of kind of practical steps, or was there one kind of that really shifted the dial that's significantly different from 5 years ago?
I think as investors, we have greater awareness of some of the issues and problems. And I think as a result of that, we have then started to implement some of these, various actions into our deal sourcing, our deal execution, and our ongoing monitoring. We've also tried to align ourselves with various individuals, governing bodies, initiatives that we can essentially helps us be a better investor when it comes to these sorts of topics. So, for example, we're a signatory to the Investing in Women Code, which is actually a government initiative to help the advancement of female entrepreneurship. And that sets out a couple of different areas where, as an investor, we can really make a difference. It can be as simple as actually just getting better data on your deal sourcing. Like I said, of all of the deals you see, how many are all male, how many are all female, how many are mixed. And then actually having internal policies and procedures that can be essentially effectuated to help make changes in the industry. The other initiative which is more VC related, is a company called diversity.vc, which is actually a sort of a community that has been created to try and help diverse, people with diverse backgrounds get into and break into VC, because we're talking about all of the issues with insurance being heavily male, and everyone looks and feels the same. Well, VC is the same. It's very, very hard to get into VC. People always say that it's from the top unis that people get into, and it's not diverse at all. And so companies like Diversity.vc are actually helping to place people either as interns or associates into firms. So our summer associate this year that's joining us from the summer is through that program. Is a lady that's obviously keen to join, get into VC, and has applied through that process. So I think it's things like that we can do alongside making changes to our process that is certainly a shift that we've seen in the last 5 years, certainly within our business.
I think that, I've got to reflect on my own industry. The recruitment and headhunting sector is very reflective. They tend to be market dependent, so they tend to mirror their markets, and the insurance and insurtech market is predominantly white middle-aged guys. That it mirrors that market, and then you have sort of all of these incremental elements like feed in, because there's biases that it's very difficult to remove unless you awareness and discuss. But discussing only goes so far, but awareness is important. But it's really interesting to hear about some of those practical steps. Sabine, to love to bring you in on something, which is, if we're all sensible people, but we're all from different businesses, we're all sitting here agreeing, and I think the acknowledgement is clearly there that diversity is important. Why do we think those inherent biases still exist when it comes to securing investment? Because I had someone on the podcast, Sam White, from Stellar Insurance, and she was saying there's even sort of gender bias in the way that female founders are questioned about their proposition, as opposed to men, and it was all about sort of, they were like negative bias questions, so we're looking for reasons to turn it down versus looking for reasons to invest. So why does that still exist?
I think, well, a key thing, when we are born, we don't have any biases, but our parents put biases in every one of us. So whether you look at Rebecca, James, or myself, we all have biases. So it's not about a gender problem, a color problem, a sexuality problem. We all have biases. Now, when you look at in the investment world, I would say, and James probably will echo what I'm saying, is, after having accelerated over 100 ventures, and when you look at my portfolio, and even the companies which applied to my acceleration program, 25% would be female founders. And now I'm just talking about female founders, because then if you actually wanting to really analyze the data, you would look at also LGBTQ and colored, people. So when we start looking at diversity, inclusion, and equity, we should not just focus on women. We should focus on a variety of minorities which are affected by investment. And James, please, at some point, maybe let's have a conversation about that. But women are definitely a group which has had difficulty getting funding. But also you will see Asian people, Black people having had difficulties getting access to funding. So when you look at biases, you have biases definitely in questions, and women tend to be asked often negative questions over men, which tend to be asked positive questions. And I'm fortunate because I work with a lot of investors, and I know EOS Ventures have actually changed their questionnaires to actually be far more equal, neutral in the way questions are being asked. And I think it's not just about investment. Even when you apply to a job, some women will actually refuse to take a specific job by just reading the job description. So it's inherent in the language we use every single day. The challenge when you go for founding is that women tend to be asked, whether they are going to have children. They are being asked, whether they are going to be sick more often than men will be asked those type of questions. Usually men tend to have growth questions, big numbers and, how they are going to scale. And women are being asked often questions as to how they are going to fail. And until we started highlighting those biases, I don't think investors would have noticed that was a major issue. And a lot of investors, because now in the world of ESG and sustainability, everybody needs to change the way they are doing things. And that means because government and regulation are imposing ways for us to be more transparent and much more clear in the way we are treating people, you will actually see that a lot of investors out there, because also they realize that women actually can return twice as much revenue than men, and that they're actually good investment targets, are adapting their questionnaires and the way they are dealing with the problem now. Let's just also remember, you mentioned the number of 2.8%. So yes, there is only 2.8% female investors out there. However, there is 12% of women who are partners in any venture fund. So it's probably a higher number. Women are as biased as men. So usually women also will apply very strong financial criteria when they select investments. So it's not because one is a woman versus a man that they are going to soften up, right? But what you do find is that women are more likely to invest in other women twice as much. So I think there's definitely something that is happening there. However, when you look at our European numbers, only 8% of women are applying for investment. So 92% of money is being asked by men. So, we need more women to become founders. So we need maybe to educate more women. So we are going back to school, STEM, to encourage women to become entrepreneurs. And so that we have a bigger number than 8% applying for investor money.
Yeah, that's I knew you'd have an amazing grasp of the facts of the data, but there's so much there. I just wanted to pick up on the interesting parallel between there's a real strong awareness out there now that the language you use on job specs, which job specifications, has a huge implication on how many people apply, who applies, but particularly just looking at women as an isolated example, women are less likely to apply for jobs where they don't have 100% of the criteria, whereas men, it's some embarrassingly low number, like 50% of the skills, and they'll apply. And that's reflective in the venture world as well, that the women were likely to give more accurate and honest predictions than men were typically supposed to inflate their numbers. And the challenge is there that you have to there's a leap of faith there from especially early stage investment. There's always this huge leap of faith, and then you're making it on the same criteria but the same numbers, but people having a sort of different intention behind their numbers. So I find that really interesting. It's such a parallel there. Rebecca, you've done a huge amount of work in this space, and I know a new part of your Instead London role, which is relatively new, I hope that you don't mind me saying, is relatively new to the insurance and insurtech world. James touched on some initiatives there that they've brought in, some of the people they've been working with. Are there things that you always implement in a new business when you're bringing in D&I initiatives? Because I'm trying to think about things people could take away if they're looking at either raising or if they're looking at an early stage business. What should they be putting in at their core that's manageable, practical stuff that you would do from day one?
So I think there are a couple of things. So, I mean, you guys already mentioned, the job descriptions, making sure they're accessible. I would go even further and say, do you need all the requirements in your job description? Because very often we hire for an imaginary, amazing person who doesn't exist and has never existed in your organization. So can you actually, do you really need all of those things? Does everyone in your current team do all of those things? Probably not. So are you over specifying the role? But I think before you even get to the advertising for the role or creating your team, you need to really think about your brand. And I know this sounds very kind of corporate-y, but actually it's really key. So for example, I've been hiring actually for 2 roles. This has been really foremost on my mind, diverse hiring, but also, high quality candidates. And I know that anyone who Googles me, and I would hope any candidate coming forward has, Googled me and LinkedIn me and whatever the terms are, that they see that actually I am a visible bring yourself to work person. I'm sure there's like a really good diverse word for that, but like that's really it. If they Googled me, they'd see podcasts about working through the menopause. The majority of my working life, I've worked flexibly, part-time, in fact, or even more controversially. I'm neurodivergent. I have neurodivergent children. I am very visible about that. I come on podcasts and events and I talk about it. And I would hope that anyone who's then looking, for example, to join Instech would see that and go, you know what, I could be myself. Like I'm a bit like that, or I might not be exactly like that, but I've got my own things going on, and like no one seems to care at Instech, so I could probably join that company. So that's even before you advertise. Kind of almost think about, are you allowing your people to express themselves, be there? It's not just about winning awards and having really great PowerPoints, which are good because that shows a really good intention, but it's also just making sure your team can be their whole self, because that will permeate everything. Everyone will know. And that's goes to the next bit, which is the interview. Let's say you get your job description right, and you haven't over specified it, you've used the right language. The interview process, what I found is, especially with Gen Z, culture is everything. Every single Gen Z person I interview asks me about culture, and they don't just mean freebies and pool tables. They genuinely mean culture. They mean can I bring my whole self to work? Is there psychological safety? They might not use those words, but that's really what they're expressing. I would never ask some of the questions that are being asked in an interview when I had started out. It wouldn't even have occurred to me that I had permission to ask those things. And that's because, for this, especially Gen Z, they're just much more willing to leave. The culture doesn't suit, they're going to leave. Their generation rent, they don't have mortgages, they don't care. It's a very, and I would hope that view permeates, and as they grow up and move into higher, roles, that they bring that, really strong cultural element. And then, something that we've touched on slightly, around the periphery is retention. So the thing is, you can attract amazing talent, but can you keep it? Most large organizations, especially now, kind of have 50-50 interns, 50-50, Q1 percentile people entering early careers. You get into Q2 and it's like a desert happened. Something happened. We only have really solid data about women, but I'm sure when things like ethnicity pay gaps and other, gap analysis comes out, it's probably not going to be too dissimilar. So you need to make sure that, as much effort as you're putting into attracting talent and judging, and even organizations judging people about how they're attracting, you also need to look at, are they retaining that talent? Because what you don't want is just, very, early careers women, and then, they've all disappeared. That's a real loss to your organization. And that's a loss of, diversity of thought, especially.
Sorry,
one
please.
thing I want to actually comment on Rebecca's commentary here, Alex, is purpose is super important for Gen Zs. But also, I think as businesses, we need to make sure that we have the right strategy to welcome those younger people. And so therefore, we need to embed and demonstrate that we are aligned to our values and our beliefs as well. So some people in the industry will tell you that I've made choices in my life and things I do and I do not do because of my beliefs and my values. And I try to make sure that I work and I surround myself by people who actually are fully diversity, equity, and inclusion focused as well. And that is very important, because that is important for the people you are recruiting in your team if you want to retain them.
I had a really interesting conversation in New York last week with a founder of a business which is it serves the Latin American insurance market. I'm gonna have to beep this out because I think it's called BRZ, but if I get that wrong, I apologise horribly, and I'll have to change it. They focus on the sort of Latinx market in the US, which is a sort of 70 million person market. And the thing that was very, very simple was, he said, it's a market that needs insurance but doesn't buy insurance because it's not represented. Like, if you look at an advert for an insurance, there's no one from the Latinx community on there, so they don't buy it. And it's very simple, and their success has all been baked into the fact that, you know, they have services and offices in Brazil that speaks Portuguese. They have service offices in, I think, Mexico, which obviously speaks Spanish. That's the kind of like those are the primary languages of all the documentation. It's just really simple when you break it down, but you think, if you don't see yourself represented in, and we're talking about venture here, but if you don't see yourself represented in, you know, the venture community, then it appears more intimidating and non-accessible. And I wanted to bring that on to James, and you know, I think you've sort of answered a question that I had about bias, because you've put some things into play. But following up on what Rebecca just said, James, how much do you dig into culture of businesses, and how important is culture, team, all of that element when you're making an investment at your stage?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I think it's not the topic that you go into, or you tend to go into on your first meeting, or your second meeting, actually. And maybe there's a debate about whether it should be further up the pecking order in terms of your assessment in those initial pitch meetings. But certainly, you know, from our perspective, as we get further into the due diligence and we really want to get to know not just the CEO, but the whole management team, and as many of the team as we can, really. And that involves actually going, because with COVID, obviously everything's being done virtually. You know, people have been doing deals virtually for 2 years, and you can meet people, you can hear the pitch, you can do a Zoom, but you still cannot beat meeting people face to face, going to the office, seeing what the work environment is like, seeing how the employees interact with each other, you know, hearing from the employees what they think about, you know, what it's like to work at the company. And that is, you know, becoming increasingly important for us as a fund to really understand that culture, that dynamic within these startups. We quite often spend time talking to the CEO about staff retention, about staff benefits, about staff morale. That all starts actually in the recruitment process. So how are you onboarding your staff? How are you positioning the business? How are you presenting yourself and the business to the candidate in the interview process, so that actually when they join, they've got a really, really clear view of the purpose of the business, the values of the business, and actually, as Rebecca said, they can be themselves at work and they can fit in with the, with the culture of the organisation. So it's not a shock on day one that they've joined a team that they're not happy in. So we definitely get to those topics, but it's probably a little bit later in the diligence phase. And you know, once we're on the board, and you know, we're working with our portfolio companies, then absolutely we're talking to them about the D&I, we're talking to them about their hiring process, we're talking to them about culture and values. And I would actually say that the startup world is probably further ahead in that type of from that respect than the big corporates. You know, the startups, you know, when you've got 10 people or 15 people, you know, culture is critical to the success of the business. You know, there's only a small number of people that you've got to work intensely with and share those same common values and beliefs and build that culture. Because if you don't, when that company gets to 150 employees, then things are going to fall apart. And so I would actually say that the startups that we speak to and that we've invested in are very, very focused on culture, because it's critical to the success of their organizations in those formative years.
How do you, I suppose this is, thank you, James. I just wanted to put this out to everyone, actually. What I'm fascinated about is how you keep that going. You know, so I think it absolutely, James and EOS as an example, investing and making sure it's kind of D&I is on the agenda. I think he's absolutely right. I think those teams, and culturally, we work with smaller businesses in our recruitment process, so culture's everything. And actually, you take culture and team fit sometimes over skill sets, because you go, well, actually, we've got to move fast together. My question for probably Sabine and Rebecca is like, how do you keep that going? How do you keep that when you get to 150? What do you see works well? Not that necessarily you guys have all the answers, but Sabine, you've seen so many early stage businesses, incubated so many, and Rebecca, you've got such an awareness of kind of what's happening in the industry and being aware at Insurtech London, seeing all these smaller businesses. How do you scale that? Because we know how to scale businesses profitably, hopefully, but scaling them culturally, how do we do that?
So Rebecca, I will just start with maybe a few points. So for me, you have to start with strategy and a view of where you are going, right? You need to have an agenda as to where you want to go. And that should form, for me, the type of culture you want to build. To echo what Jane just said, culture is at the end of the day everything, despite the fact that 71% of us are prepared to work from anywhere in the world than get a promotion. Mm-hmm. Only 13% of people want to go back to the office today. So most of us want to work remotely or have an hybrid culture. So you have now to build with a very, very different lifestyle and fulfill a need of an employee who needs to work, who needs to enjoy their family and have that work-life balance. So once you have strategy, agenda, and then you actually have defined some level of culture with your value and beliefs, then you go and find the people who are actually going to fit, if I can use the word fit, within that. And you also need to be aware of where the market is going. So this is 71%. What I've done personally recently is try to drive flexibility, like Rebecca mentioned. So I don't always go for full-time employees. I try to find people who fit my culture. So if they said, Sabine, you know what, I would love to work with you, but can I do 50%? Okay, let's see how we can work something together. I also, I love working with younger people and give them talent. So when you look at my job description, everybody gets a license to a training platforms where they can learn whatever they want. For sure, they need to learn what my business needs to grow, but they actually can learn anything they want and they love it. And, when we talk about the things they actually went to search on, it's interesting because a lot of them want to be super CEOs. And so they are going to look at how to present to the CEOs, which I love because that helps me as well. Other things, we had in our office is probably the beer fridge. Well, I said, you know what, if you like drinking like I do like drinking a beautiful red wines, I will send you a nice bottle of red wines. And James and Sam know I like my wines. And we actually try to do wine testing together where they actually are going to learn about wine and actually how they can pair wine with food. So we try to be really innovative in the way we do things, and hopefully that make them happy. And hopefully as we work together as well, we can actually learn to work better together and in trustworthy manner. So I try to apply new techniques, which I learned from a lot of the startups I've worked with, to my own team to actually hopefully retain the talent that I acquire today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think just to add on to Sabine's, I love your practical suggestions. So one of the things that I brought into Insurtech is that everyone in my team has a people and culture KPI, because I think very often culture ends up being, usually in larger organizations, a small select group of usually white women. It's a very weird phenomenon. I don't know how it happens. And it's just not acceptable. Culture is everybody's responsibility. And also those people don't represent everybody in the organization. So it's a weird dichotomy that happens. And actually, by doing that, you're empowering everybody to take a little bit of the business, whether it is creating the CSR program or, getting another 3 early careers people to develop that, whether it is committing, like one of my colleagues is, to do some podcasts to show the diversity of the industry, to try and show that, role models, especially early careers role models, so they don't have to be monumental KPIs, but everybody is doing a tiny bit of people and culture, which means it doesn't just sit with, the COO or the head of people and culture. And it also just doesn't sit with like a small committee hidden away somewhere. Everybody is owning that. And for me, that's crucial because as organizations grow, having worked in a lot of corporate organizations, what unfortunately happens is if you get big enough, then actually diversity dies with managers. And I would love it to be some other way, but it's not. Once you get to a large enough size organization where there's maybe 3 or 4 levels between the CEO and an average manager, then actually everybody at the CEO level could be completely committed to diversity, and you can have early careers people below committed to diversity. But if you have managers who are completely overwhelmed, so don't have time to add this to their bucket, but also, maybe they didn't grow up. Literally, they didn't grow up with a culture of DEI. So, I think that's really important is when people are looking at organizations is to say, actually, your average manager, how committed, like, I know you, the CEO, is really committed, and I've seen some really, really interesting, exciting work in early careers, but what's your average manager? Are you giving them time and space to do this? Because actually, if they're not committed, nothing, like literally nothing is going to change in your organization. You're going to spend so much money doing nothing.
Yeah. Sorry, Alex, so I just add, actually, I mean, I completely agree with what Sabine and Rebecca are saying. But the only thing I would add is that I think to answer your question, it really does start with leadership as well, though. So it's about tone from the top. So I completely agree with Rebecca that actually you need to have obviously that middle management support, really pushing it and driving it within the organization. But it starts with leadership. I think if you look at, big examples recently where there has been, well-published, well-documented, like toxic culture at some of these big insurtechs, it's really a toxic CEO or management team that has resulted in that poor culture filtering down through the whole organization. And so I do think it really sort of starts with the strong leadership, strong management team, the right people in the right places to really help drive that and filter that through the whole organization. And I think the buck ultimately stops, with that senior team.
Yeah. One thing also, James, is, when you look, Alex, at startups, often startups are founded by 3 friends. Often, right? And often it's 3 mates, male friends, who came together to build the next insurtech, and they got comfortable in the way they actually build their businesses. And then one day we have these things called DEI and ESG, and you have the wake-up call, but it doesn't mean that you always have been able to adapt your behavior. So there is a lot of behavioral change we need to accept and recognize. We all need to go through biases you mentioned earlier, and recognize that we need more leaders, women, in the top table as well today.
Something that this is something Rebecca and I talked about her making change event, actually, which is amazing, by the way. But it's a private dinner party gig, so unfortunately it's it's not open to the public. But it was very good. And one thing that we talked about there was about the opportunity, and bring this full circle back to venture-backed insurtech businesses. Was a huge opportunity there. It's very difficult to make change, even from the sort of CEO down, because what I felt the conversation was guilty of was sort of slinging at mud at the CEO of kind of publicly funded companies and saying, like they had kind of full reign. It's like, no, CEOs are beholden to shareholders, and the shareholders sometimes kind of less flexible on saying, right, we want to make this changes for, they want profit over good culture sometimes, because that's the nature of the beast. Venture-backed businesses, when you've got supportive venture partners like EOS kind of making changes in their own criteria, what they look at, what they think is important, and they're joining your board, there's an opportunity to have permission to say, right, top down, we think this is important. We're going to support you and we're putting the money in. Then that gives the CEO permission to go, right, I believe in this, let's make it happen. And then that feeds down to the managers. So we're going on a practical level, we won't tolerate this going forward. And I had a great conversation with Sten from Zigo and on the podcast, and he was saying about, evaluating your staff against culture. And it's exactly your point, Rebecca, because there's no point saying it and agreeing it and trying to hire for it. And then once you're in, it's like, we leave that person alone because they're the top performing salesperson, or they're the top performing XYZ. And then they get to sort of not adhere to the culture values. So I think that's where the exciting opportunity for me is. If you've got venture businesses like EOS coming in and saying, look, we're going to support you on this journey, then that gives permission. And I think that's unique to venture-backed businesses at the earliest stage of their existence. That's my little soapbox moment. I'm sorry there. But I wanted to ask this of everyone. I'm really conscious of time. And, we've talked on a really sort of diverse and some great kind of comments from you guys. What's your kind of one last piece of advice to entrepreneurs, insurtechs out there that you would have them to kind of think about, focus, practically implement? You can be as diverse as you like on this. I'm gonna go the reverse way around this way, because let's start with Sabine. What would be your one thing that you'd want someone to take away from a conversation about this topic?
Well, that DI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is accessible, and it's all about mindset. If any business want to grow tomorrow, they have to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion within their team, because they need to reflect the customer of the future. And that customer is actually, when you think about Gen Z, I would say they are pretty fluid. And I'm using that word very carefully. They actually do not even see color, are colorblind, and they are, sexuality blind as well. So you actually have to really understand how they feel, how they buy, how they do things. And often it's by recruiting people who look like them.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thank you. Rebecca, what would be your one nugget for everyone to take away?
I think I would maybe encourage the 10% who have a really good idea and maybe fear they should self-select out. Don't ask for permission. Try it. There are people like Sabine, there are other female role models out there in insurtech who would be there championing you on, supporting you. There's organizations, I think it's Carbon 13, focused on ESG and women. There are organizations who can be your cheerleaders. So you're not having to do this all by yourself. So, if we can just capture that 10%, that boosts the amount of women going in to the process of getting funding, and that could only lead to more women getting funding overall.
Fantastic. And James, time this badly to give you the final word. What would be your takeaway?
No, I echo what Rebecca says. I think you surround yourselves with people who are smarter than you on this topic. Whether it's initiatives like I mentioned before, or whether it's like subject matter experts like Sabine and Rebecca. But I think it sort of all stems down, comes down to, get educated on some of the issues within the industry, why it's important to take note, what tangible actions can you take to really make a difference. I think to Sabine's point earlier, part of it is around female founders having access to capital and getting in front of VCs. But I think maybe the bigger issue is actually, increasing the number of female entrepreneurs in the first place. And, given where we are from a macro economic and geopolitical environment at the moment, and how there's a bit of a market correction coming and the end of a bull run, now is the time, or maybe in 12 months' time, will be a brilliant opportunity to, establish and found new companies. And there's going to be a huge amount of talent that unfortunately may lose their jobs in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. Now is a real opportunity for the organizations that can sort of ride the storm to go out there, real make tangible changes to their sort of D&I and ESG policies, hire great talent, diverse talent, to emerge stronger out the back of any sort of market correction or downturn. And really, there's a huge opportunity ahead. And if that can breed more female founders or diverse founders, then that would be brilliant.
I would like to add, Alex, and working with humble investors like EOS Venture Partners, James and Sam, who actually have been amazing at evaluating any company I brought to them. And I have to say, they are learning, but they are not saying, they're actually doing the stuff too.
Thank you, Sabine. And Sabine had the last word.
yeah. No, I've got to wrap it up now. But no, the thing I wanted to say is that, and Rebecca taught me this, and she's very kind to teach me this, was just like not be scared to sort of discuss it as well, and get it. Part of me that was dying inside when I put this question out, and I went, so guys, what do you think? Because that's my default settings to say guys, and I'm like, ultimately I'm instantly going, oh, in the context of this conversation, it's a terrible choice of language, but it's to get it, you're looking to get it right more than you get it wrong, and that's all we're looking to do. And I think there's too much about it that's frightening and scary, and it's about encouragement of networks, and the purpose of this webinar was to kind of tackle some of those issues, get it into part of the conversation, and obviously just improve the opportunities to network. So thank you very much, Rebecca, Sabine, James, for being part of this conversation. Really glad we got to do it. And I appreciate all of your time very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Cool.
Thank you, Alex.